Okay, well thank you all for coming out this afternoon. We're coming to the end of the 100th anniversary presentation series. The last one that we'll be doing is next week with Anna Ferriello's set of 3 programs. So, and all of the ones that are in this series have been put up on YouTube. So I guess now it's more speaking to the recording, and to y'all too, who haven't been here before. If you've missed any of the presentations for the 100th anniversary, you can go back and watch them on YouTube. So I'm Susanna Pyatt. I'm the Collections and Archives Manager here at the Folk School, and today I'm talking about highlights from the archives and our object collection with a focus on Appalachian heritage, which is kind of hard to pull together because we're in Appalachia, and so most of the collection is Appalachian heritage. So I kind of focus more on items that are from really long-term traditions in the area, or families who have been here for a long time period. And it could be considered that what we do now is also part of contemporary Appalachia, and will be part of Appalachian heritage, but for the sake of doing this program, I'm going to condense it down a little bit. So I want to start off by talking about the Log Cabin Museum, because interest in Appalachian heritage has been part of the folk school since the very beginning. The Log Cabin Museum was put on campus in 1926. It was moved here entirely by community volunteer labor in the first months of the folk school. And one of the cabins came from Cherokee County and one from Clay County, and one from the 1850s and one from the 1890s. And the community constructed them, moved them on site, connected them with a dog trot and a roof, and turned it into a community museum. The co-founders of the folk school were really interested in preserving Appalachian heritage, and so this museum was their way, in part, of doing that. And so community members also donated items, like all the ones that you can see in the photos here, to the museum. We don't have great documentation of what exactly was in the museum. We can tell from the photos, like the warping reel that you can see on the right, with its corncob spools, that's still in the museum today. I think the head of that rake is in the archives, or at least one similar to it. We do have a list, this is from a brochure from the 80s, of all of some of the original furnishings. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of information with the oldest items in the collections about where they came from or whether or not they were in the Log Cabin Museum originally. But there are some that we can kind of piece together, like those andirons are on the list, and also in that photograph from the previous slide. And that cupboard probably was also one of the original furnishings based on the list. And it has one of the salt boxes nailed to its side too that's on the list. And we do have some older items that may or may not be from Appalachia. It's quite likely that they are, and that they were donated to the museum in its early years. They've gone back into the current museum after it's been renovated, but we just don't have really good information about most of these pieces to know at what point they were donated or where they originally came from. I'll talk a lot here and there about Douglas Day and David Rose. So in the late 1980s, the folk school received a grant to fund what they called the Folklore Project. And that led to the hiring of Douglas Day as a folklorist to work here. And then after him was David Rose. And so they did a lot of field collecting, recording, and ethnography, including a lot of music recordings that are now in the archives, a lot of oral history interviews, and then photographs related to that field work, and eventually some publications and exhibits that came out of it. So I'll end up referring back to all of those kind of throughout the presentation. And I've done 2 collection highlights programs already, so one on music and dance and one on the Appalachian Craft Revival. So I'm not going to rehash a lot of those because, again, they're on YouTube. But we do have a lot of publications related to Appalachian music and dance in the archive, like dance instruction books, songbooks and sheet music, and also scholarly research that's been published about music and dance. There's musical instruments, there's hundreds of audio and video recordings, and then also some commercial tapes and CDs. So here's some examples of play party and singing game books that are in the archives. and some examples of Appalachian or Southern square dance books. For musical instruments, which again I talked about more in the previous program, we have a lot of mountain dulcimers, or Appalachian dulcimers, over 2 dozen, so that's most of our instruments in the collection. We have some by Homer Ledford, both dulcimers and banjos. He was from Eastern Kentucky and attended school here. That's where he learned how to make instruments. So we're happy to have several of his pieces. We have some by local luthiers, and also several by Leonard and Clifford Glenn from further northeast in the state. For ballads and folk songs, we have copies of Olive Dane Campbell's ballad collection. So she collected these in southern Appalachia when she was working with her husband John in the early 1900s. And she was also working with Cecil Sharp, the English folk song collector, to publish those. The originals for her collection are actually now at the English Folk Dance and Song Society in England, and they're available online through that organization. But we have the copies here in physical copies, and we also have a copy of Douglas Day's dissertation that he wrote in the early 90s about her ballad collection. We have some audio recordings for ballads, so Elisha Hall, Earl Martin, and May Scroggs were all local to this area. The recordings for Elisha would be pretty early too. I think he died in the 1940s. And we have some from elsewhere in North Carolina by Lois Duncan, the Queen family, and by Sheila K. Adams, who of course is like a pretty regular instructor here currently. And a pretty interesting manuscript by another folklorist, Lee Knight. This is from the late 70s or early 80s, I believe, on ballads, folk songs, and stories from Cherokee and Clay counties. And some of what the folklorist did was published. So Douglas Day put together this Mountain Valley music set of, it's a cassette tape. The musicians are listed up on the screen. And also a 40 to 50 page booklet that went along with it and that profiles the musicians based on the oral history interviews that he did with them. And then later, the folk school also produced Meeting in the Air, Sacred Music of the Southern Appalachians, which is kind of a similar blend of publishing the music recordings and information from oral histories that was collected by the folklorists. And then there are hundreds of music recordings in the archives. These are just a few names that stood out of local musicians. And the Wilson brothers are pictured on here, and the church choir from Texana, just down the road in Murphy. So we have a lot of recordings that are related to folk school events, of course, like fall festival performances, concerts on campus, but also a lot of field recordings where the folklorists were going out to people's homes or to local gospel singings or local churches and doing recordings there. And I didn't put them on the list because they're pretty numerous, but there's also groups tied in with the folk school, whether staff or really involved community members who are in the archives too. And then craft history is another one that I'll kind of breeze over more quickly because there's the craft revival presentation already online. We have some pretty significant collections of weaving drafts and drawdowns. Probably the biggest one is the Hogan family collection. They were gathering weaving drafts or drawdowns in the 1930s, I believe, to use for their own production company of weaving products in North Georgia. We have a lot of pieces of weaving and fiber arts. Though again, a lot of that is not as well documented as one might wish. We have a couple of collections of dye recipe cards. Most interesting, perhaps, one from Louise, and now I'm blanking on her name. Pittman. It's just bad. Yeah, Louise Pittman, thank you. Who was one of the big natural dyers from like the mid-20th century. Really important in the history of natural dyeing. We have a lot of photographs and oral histories related to the craft history, so helping to document the lives of different craftspeople. Wood carvings is definitely the biggest collection in terms of number. There's about 1,700 wood carvings in the catalog, mostly made by the Brasstown carvers. And then we have some other examples of furniture making and wood turning and other kinds of woodwork. And then pottery and ironwork are also represented pretty well in the archive. So for pottery, a lot of the pottery that we have is by people who moved into the area, kind of bringing their own unique art styles. A lot of the work is by people who were resident artists here. So Lynn Galt, who started the pottery program here in 1952, he actually started by teaching out of his home studio. There wasn't a pottery studio on campus yet. And Bethany did a really nice presentation about him earlier that's on YouTube. We have pieces by Lee Davis, Bonnie Staffel, and Marcia Bugg, who were all resident artists here at various points. Pieces from local potters Harry Kern and Rob Withrow, who both teach here too. The vase that's on the screen is by Phil and Terry Mayhew, who were they were in North Georgia at one point, and then I think mostly did their work in East Tennessee. Some historical pieces from Pisgah Forest pottery. Some pieces made in classes that were taught by Bob Owens, who was a teacher in North Georgia, I think University of North Georgia. But most of the pieces that we have are ones that were like collaborative and were done by the students at the folk school. And then two really traditional North Georgia potters. We have some pieces by them in the archives. So one of them is W.J. Gordy. We have about a half dozen of his pieces. And he learned from his family members in North Georgia. And so part of that pretty long-standing tradition. And he taught at the folk school some as well. And then a couple weeks ago, someone donated this vase jug by Linear Metters, so another pretty long-standing family tradition from North Georgia. And we have a lot of baskets in the archives. And I think a lot of historic baskets, but I don't know too much about those because they did not come with information about who made them or when they were donated. But for the ones that I do know, this white oak basket at the top was made by Ken and Kathleen Dalton from East Tennessee, who were white oak basket makers who taught, I think, quite a bit at the folk school. And we have a couple pieces from Eastern Kentucky, the Redbird Mission, made by Patsy Mosley. And then basketry is where, in the archives, Cherokee traditions are best represented. So we have a lot of pieces by various Cherokee artists, including Emma Garrett, Lucille Osiah, Marion Wolf, Medina Wildcat, Nancy Constein, Eva Reed, and Betty Maney. And here's some examples. There's two double-walled river cane baskets that are in the archives, but unfortunately I don't know who made them. And then different examples of types of materials and basket styles by Cherokee artists. And the one by Betty Maney came in this year, literally in January, was when she finished making it. And then we acquired that to go out with the folk school special exhibits for the 100th anniversary. We have a couple pieces that are identified as from Coker Creek Crafts in East Tennessee. And if anybody knows more about them, I would love to know more. Because I don't know if it was a craft shop or if it was like a cooperative or like what their origin was. But we have at least one basket and several weavings by them. And we have some pieces by Wilma Hatchett McNabb. She was a weaver from the Bellevue community in Cherokee County and learned from her mother, Sarah Sonoma Hatchett, or Granny Hatchett. And we have Granny Hatchett's loom is actually on campus, but in storage. And some photos of Wilma too. So on the left, she is dressed in an outfit that was given to the Log Cabin Museum. That photo is probably from around the 1930s or so. We have a couple photos of her weaving too. And the one on the right was taken by Douglas Day as part of his process of nominating her for a North Carolina Folk Heritage Award. And then finally for objects, here's some examples of cornhusk dolls from the archives. I don't know too much about Pearl Bowling. I think she was from East Tennessee. But Mae Ritchie Deschamps, we have several dolls by her. And she grew up in Eastern Kentucky. She's the older sister, one of the older sisters of Jean Ritchie, the singer. And Mae married Leon Deschamps. I think he was at Pine Mountain Settlement School at that point. But then the family moved to the folk school for a long time, where Leon was the forester here. He taught surveying classes. He was the architect behind a lot of the buildings on campus. And Mae was pretty well known for making cornhusk dolls. And then moving on to like more of the traditional archives side of things, some local history materials. We have the collection of Fred O. Scroggs papers, and Fred was really instrumental in getting the folk school here in Brasstown. He had attended college at Young Harris, but was better known as a shopkeeper and businessman in Brasstown. And when he found out that Marguerite Butler was in Murphy to try to find a location for the folk school, he went to Murphy and met her and tried to convince her to bring it to Brasstown, successfully, obviously, and generated a lot of local support that demonstrated to Marguerite and Olive that the folk school should be located here. So for his collection, he was really interested in local history, in indigenous heritage, and in rocks and minerals. So we have a lot of his family's papers from the errant Scroggs and Strange families going back into the 19th century. Correspondence from them, financial and land records, notes about their genealogy and family history stories, but also a lot of newspaper clippings about local matters, maps of Brasstown, especially like hand-drawn property maps, and about 500 photographs from his family. So some highlights from that collection. These land deeds are from 1838 and 1839. So Fred's mother was Lily Strange Scroggs, so she inherited land from her family, the Strange family. And then part of that land, a small section of it, was either donated or sold to the folk school as its first acreage that the folk school owned. But these deeds are the Strange family buying that land from the U.S. government, or the state of North Carolina, that had been Cherokee land. So we have in the archives the very direct link between Cherokee land dispossession and the folk school grounds. On a lighter note, we also have some drawings by Fred O. Scroggs of local places, are the ones that I pulled out. So we have Young Harris College Auditorium and then Lake Chateau. Just some examples of newspaper clippings, of letters, and the hand-drawn property maps from him. And the letters I think are particularly interesting, is the ones from like World War II. That's the family trying to stay connected and keep in touch with each other while people went into the service or took defense jobs elsewhere. Some examples of really nice family photos from the collection. And these are all local families again. And this collection is probably both the oldest documents and the oldest photographs in the archive. Some examples of local businesses. The one on the left is probably the Mountain Valley Creamery truck that is picking up eggs in Murphy. And the one on the right was the cooperative sweet potato curing house that was built in Brasstown in the late 1940s.
Still across the street from the post office.
It is still across the street. It does not look at all like a cinder block building anymore. Yeah, this is, I think, the only photo that I've seen of the original.
Is that then the house that's right across the street?
It's not it's a ramshackle storage structure.
Yeah.
No, it's turned into a rental house now.
Yeah, okay.
They just did some renovations.
Oh, that's great.
He's done, the interior looks really nice.
Yeah.
You would not have known that it was built for a sweet potato curing house at all.
Co-op.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last of the Brasstown co-ops.
Yeah.
It didn't last long, did it?
Like 2 years.
Yeah.
There's several photos of this group river baptism. I think it would be interesting to see if we could locate like where on the river that like usual spot would be for baptisms.
What's so interesting is just how there's just not any foliage, any trees along.
There wasn't a tree in
right?
Smoky Mountain Park,
Yeah.
What river did you say?
I'm assuming it's that one, but I don't know that for sure. I don't think they're labeled. And then I thought this photo was funny, just because you never know where your family vacation photos are going to be. And then Mercer Scroggs, one of Fred's children, made these models of Brasstown buildings. I have not tried to match them up with buildings or photographs yet. I think that would be a fun project. But these are just a really sweet object in the collections. And then there's kind of two notable collections of photographs that show life in like the 1920s to 1940s in this area. One of them is Doris Ullman's photos. We have over 200 of them. They were taken around 1929 to 1933. And David Leiden just did a really great presentation about them that is now also on YouTube. And then Marguerite Butler Bigstrop's materials were donated to the folk school in 2024. And she has like thousands and thousands of photos in there. And I'm still working on digitizing them. I thought I was done, and then I found a miscellaneous folder that I'd forgotten about that turns out is really awesome photos from the Brasstown area. So that's what most of these are pulling from, are things I've digitized in just the last couple weeks. She was not very good about writing information on them, unfortunately. But on the left, there's some people making sorghum, and there's like a whole series of photos of this location and of the process of making sorghum in the collection. And also, I think some silent film footage, just a little bit. Because some of Marguerite's photos seem to match up with the silent film footage of the folk school. In the middle is an example of, she has just a few shots that show like the interiors of people's homes, which are pretty interesting, in addition to like the people who were living there too. And then some really great family portraits, like the one on the right. And then here's another one. Again, the people aren't always identified. I really want to know who this couple is, because there's several photos of the couple that's on the right. Maybe this is an anniversary celebration of some sort, because she's holding a bouquet in all the photos. And then a couple photos of like the entire extended family is what I'm missing. The image is showing, with the couple in the middle there. And then also some photos of people like doing different tasks about their daily life. So in this case, there's women carding wool on the front porch of their home. And sometimes I'm able to pair out like Doris Ullman photos and Marguerite's photos, where various of Marguerite's photos, where some are labeled and some aren't, and be able to kind of piece together more information about the families. So on the left is a Doris Ullman photo of Fanny and Zilla Wilson. They were from Highlands, North Carolina. And then we have several other photos of them with other family members from probably the early 1930s too. So this is at, I think, maybe one of their brothers' houses, but I'm not totally sure, on the right, with family members. And here, the photo on the right goes Tom and Stella Wilson, who are their niece and nephew, who were students here. I don't actually know which one is Fanny and which one is Zilla of the two. But they're both in the photo, and then another either sister or niece probably. And on the left is the same family grouping, but with some folk school staff, with Louise Pittman's in that photo. And here we have Nancy Sue Waldrop in, I think this is some people's favorite photo from Doris Ullman, or maybe it's a smaller child looking out the log cabin window. And then on the right is probably W.E. Waldrop's family, so him and his wife Nancy, his son Ed, and Ed's wife Georgia. Nancy Sue Waldrop is a baby, and Hoyt Waldrop. And we have this photo too of Nancy Sue. I think this is one of the cutest ones. She looks very mischievous. I don't know if it shows up well on the screen. And some more Waldrop, probably, photos. Ed Waldrop's house on the right, and W.E. Waldrop with chicken and sheep on the left. And we have also, again, like kind of a series of photos of him with the livestock. And this one I was pretty excited to find. The Doris Ullman photos of Jason Reed are identified him as a chair maker in the Blairsville area in Georgia. And then there's a series of photos of him in Marguerite's papers with a mill building, and also inside his home. And you can see in the images, the interior shots, like this kind of traditional way of, in Appalachian homes, of layering the inside walls with paper and magazines that people had on hand. And like, I have not seen very many photos of this, so that was exciting. And also exciting is that Marguerite did label this photo, and she says it's Jason Reed, chair maker. He made some of the chairs in the community room without using any nails. So that's the only link I've seen that actually identifies him as one of the chair makers for like those chairs. And every once in a while in the archives, we can really trace a family in more depth with like their impact on the folk school or the folk school's impact on them. And that's the case for like the J.O. and Callie Penland family. So J.O. and Callie had 3 children named Lily, Mae, Hollis, and Frankie. We have J.O. Penland's pledge card. So this was what Fred Scroggs solicited from local members to pledge their support for the folk school in 1925. And here is J.O. and Callie perhaps making good on that pledge by planting shrubbery around the log cabin museum. Have a photo of their house. We have photos of them making brooms, perhaps as part of the craft guild that the folk school started. We have hand-drawn portraits of them by June Coolidge Carey, Dan Campbell's niece, who was here in 1928. We can even see how realistic they are because we have a photo of the kids from the same time period. A Doris Ullman photo of J.O. Penland carving. He was one of the Brasstown carvers. In the center is him and Hollis. This one was labeled, which was nice. Labeled as them constructing the log barn in 1936, which was interesting because I had always assumed it was built at the same time as the log cabin museum. But apparently they constructed it here in 1936. And then the final photo is J.O. with George Bidstrup. They're noted in the Brasstown Blotter, which is a fun 1940s newsletter that the folk school put out that was also like the Facebook for Brasstown at the time period. Especially in World War II, it became really important, not just for tracking like who was getting married and having children, but also who was leaving Brasstown to go into the military service or into like war defense jobs or factory jobs to support the war effort. Because there was apparently just a whole lot of movement out of Brasstown during those few years of the war to help support the war efforts. So we have Lily Mae standing up with a loom in this room, probably. Looks like this room. Hollis on the right of that photo, dressed for the nativity play here. And what early records we have of students tend to be these index cards created after the fact that try to track what students are doing after they leave. So in this case, mostly he was doing farming. Hollis did attend Berea for a year, and he carved hogs. He was also a Brasstown carver. So those are wood carvings, not literal hogs. I assume to pay for his way through Berea. He worked with George Bidstrup a bit. He also worked at the Alcoa plant in Maryville, Tennessee. That might have been a World War II era job. And probably was doing farming most of his life. And some photos of him as a student. And then Frankie, we have some photos of her as a young woman. She also attended the folk school, so we have an index card for her. She got married pretty soon after her session at the folk school. She was only about 18 years old. And they helpfully noted that hers was the first wedding at the folk school and was held in farmhouse. And I'm pretty sure that we have photos from it. Again, they're not labeled. But that sure looks in the center like J.O. and Callie and Hollis. And all of the photos from this wedding are at farmhouse. And then finally, Douglas Day interviewed Frankie and Lily Mae about the early years of the folk school in 1988, so that's in the archives. Which brings us to oral histories. We have a lot. There's over 260 individual recordings in the archives. They started with Blanche Scroggs-Smith, another child of Fred O. She worked at the folk school for many years and interviewed mostly family members in the 1970s. And then most of the interviews are by those folklorists, Douglas and David. A lot of the interviews focus on folk school themes, so craft history and traditional music and dance, but there's other local history topics in there too. And then we've been doing oral histories since then as well. So for the 100th anniversary, we've been working on an oral history project. Really since 2018, there's been some kind of effort to document the stories of people who have been involved with folk school for the most recent 50 years. We have about 40 of those conducted so far. And then to revamp the Log Cabin Museum, Kelly Totten did 15 interviews with local people about like what it's like to live in this part of Appalachia. So yeah, that's it. for access to the archive. My email is up there. Does anybody have any questions?
No questions, but that's exciting.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.